If we want people to stay in the academic world, we should make it a bit nicer because, the industry is trying to tempt people away with a lot of things.
Dr. John Fletcher, CEO and Chief Scientist at the Innovation Game.
Hype and science tend not to mix. A lot of people who are very good scientists tend to be kind of allergic to hype.
Oh, clickbait. We hate it. Like, the last thing any, scientist wants to be part of is some clickbait blog post, that simplifies the findings far too much. Yeah, you're right. We have an allergy to super hyped and clickbait titles because of the culture that is instilled. We don't want to be your dose of dopamine. We'd rather be in there for like the long-term learning effects rather than just the single hit.
Bonded by Science, proudly presented by Noble Blocks.
I was unaware that like every company that is launching something, either their own chain or an application that would run on chain, that they have a white paper. And when I was first, brought into this circle, someone asked if I could help write their white paper. And as a scientist, I was like, oh, sure, like, let me take a look. But I didn't realize that the white paper in this space it's not just about like a finding. It's more about the business model and explaining its relevance and why it works. So the white paper has a very different purpose compared to a white paper that originally kind of came from like its scientific roots, like a more simplified understanding of like deeper knowledge. So I'm quite curious to know like how much time did you spend like putting your white paper together? Because I know how much time it takes to put together a scientific article, but this is also including like the business plan and arguing your position in the market as well.
So it took a long time, actually, really, because it was rewritten many times. The original idea of the Innovation Game was much more sort of stripped down, and it didn't appreciate all of the nuances, which I later came to recognize. One of the big ones was the relevance of open source, the open source movement, and also the economics of science, which is my personal view is that sort of blockchain and crypto is really, if it was the closest thing it should be to that already exists is economics. I think that's the most important component of it. Sometimes it's dressed up in a lot of talk about cryptography and so on and so forth. I think a lot of that seems to be, the purpose it serves practically is to sort of bedazzle people and think maybe investors and think, oh well, these guys must be so smart, let's sort of give them some money. Because it looks very technical, but I think the shortcomings of almost all crypto projects that don't make sense are really essentially shortcomings in the economics. So the economics of science, I didn't even fully appreciate until, I don't know, relatively recently, the last couple of years, that this was such a developed field. Reading up on it, I realized, I'm sure some people out there will disagree with me, but it sort of, they got very far and then it seemed to sort of halt a little bit, and then people maybe they got to a certain point and they couldn't figure out, how some fields kind of, you have like a winter in some fields. I feel like there's a winter in the economics of science. And as for open source, again, it was they were trying to solve the same problem in open source for many years, but we just didn't realize it until relatively recently. So I really wanted to bring that into the white paper to say, in fact, this is a problem that's been considered before. And it was laid out 25 years ago, in fact, at the very beginning of the open source movement, about how to fund certain types of projects which didn't fit with the usual open source economic model. And again, they just never solved it. It was considered sort of intractably hard. But one of the things that the Innovation Game does, and we can talk about that a bit later if you like, is that it solves a special case of this sort of famous problem, which was outlined about how do you remunerate people in some kind of monetary fashion, sort of commensurate with the quality of their contributions in an open source project. The white paper is actually, I would say it's still not quite fixed. I really want to get it into the final form where I would say, okay, let's just leave it. I still don't think it's there. I'm a bit of a perfectionist. I keep changing things and improving things. Interestingly, actually, AI was really useful to me because I have all of these sort of ideas and I write them down. To me, they sound a bit rambling, but the AI was quite good at sort of making it flow better, because it ends up being disjointed because I change it so much. It ends up not feeling a bit disconnected from one thing to another. So I found, with the advent of AI, it helped me with my writing. That's
Yeah. I mean, it's definitely been a tool that I think a lot of people have leaned on for inspiration, and in this case, for like having another editor look at your work and just apply some of the knowledge that it's been able to, I guess, encode and help you out. So
absolutely. I mean, it can help with knowledge. In my case, it really sort of hit the spot because it was about, I guess, this sort of smoothness thing. And it sounds like it shouldn't be important, but sometimes new ideas, I mean, as I'm sure you know, are it's quite complicated stuff and it's quite difficult. And the last thing you want is stilted presentation, because it's hard enough to understand it, even if your presentation is quite smooth and logical. So yeah.
I've always, like, even when I do presentations, and I guess now when I'm starting to make, some of this content like this and other types of content for communicating what we're doing at Noble Blocks, I try to create like a picture in someone else's mind. And I think
Yes.
if you can do that with your papers, regardless if it's a white paper or blog or some sort of blog or other type of outlet, then, you really have to build that image. So if you have these big jumps and then suddenly you lose the image and then you lose the flow, it's easier said than done. I think that's why communication is such an art form. And the one thing where, like, some of the work that I've done in the past, like I've helped companies like utilize content and findings coming out of science, like some recent developments where they're bringing new products to market that you can't really rely on AI because no one's done it before. So like in this case, like you couldn't ask it to write about the business model for the innovation game or why it's going to, lead to a lot of new discoveries, because it simply didn't, like, it's new. And how do you push that newness in a market that is constantly changing? So I think that's the exciting part also about with the white paper too. It's like, I know it's much more tailored to like the area that you're working in, and we'll dive into that and have a lot of questions too. But I think it might be helpful just to like clarify at this point, like what is the niche that the innovation game serves? Like you say the economics of science, and that is a very, very loaded phrase. So what is the niche that you're serving or that you're operating in now? And then let's take that and extrapolate it to potential other niches down the line.
Yes, sure. So I think a lot of things that the economics of science just sort of map on to what we're doing, but what the innovation game is about specifically is algorithms. So algorithms really, I mean, the thing is, a good way to think about it is software. Algorithms are software. They're sort of embodied in code. At least when people use them, they almost always use them as something which is coded up in a particular programming language. They're computer hardware to runs algorithms and basically processes data. So the way that this fits in science, I mean, of course, sort of algorithms are not far from being all science, but in the sense they touch all science. So there's a bit of a kind of a very sort of subtle phrase, which is a bit unfortunate sort of in the phrasing. I'm sure you know that computer science is a subject that many people are interested in. They study at university. But what we really look at is something slightly different: computational science. So computational science is computational biology, computational chemistry, computational physics. And it's slightly different from computer science because computer science is really an area of maths, even though it's called computer science. So this is like, this is where it gets a little bit confusing. So what our focus is on computational science, but also on sort of maths and engineering. And so the kind of things we were looking at, it's best to sort of, probably think about it through a few examples. So the algorithms which turn measurements of a magnetic field in an MRI machine into images of the body. That would be a kind of classic example of an algorithm which is sort of interesting in science and technology. You might have heard about protein folding problem. Now they can do that quite successfully on computers. So that's another example of an algorithm. I think you would have all sorts of things which say, the algorithms which make databases so fast. So these are kind of very general things. I suppose in the sort of CERN particle accelerator, they collect a lot of data and they put it into a database, but it needs to sort of be able to read and write from that database quickly. And there are all sorts of subroutines which are running sort of very clever ways to make that more efficient. So a lot of them are sort of in the background and people tend sort of not to notice them, but anybody that uses a computer in their work, which I suppose is almost all scientists these days, even the experimentalists, very much benefit from this. And another way which it touches sort of, very traditional science is that my understanding is that a lot of scientists who are doing work in labs these days, they often use sort of computer models to say, maybe suggest or guide what experiments might be the best ones to do first, for example, because it can tell you, I did a simulation and this experiment seemed to come out with a positive result. And of course, you've got to check that in the real world because computer simulations are sort of very far from perfect. But what they find is that the people who are guided by computer simulations increasingly tend to sort of maybe hit the jackpot and get what they want sooner. So it's increasing the efficiency of science, increasing the output of scientists. So, yeah, I would just say, far from being all science, but it does seem to sort of creep into every area of science sort of increasingly, this sort of computational aspect.
I'm really glad that you brought up like very specific examples because I was considering, when I was reading this, I mean, we have so many marvels that we're enjoying, like so many innovations that we have today that we, like you said, we don't even think about it. How will you, because traditionally science has been so incremental, right? So it's like, it is, and one of the challenges, I think, if we go back to the economics of science, how do you reward people properly for their contributions? And the academic industry has been struggling with this for years because, if everyone comes together and puts in a little bit and then one person takes that and has that, like the aha moment or, and you kind of think, well, you like whose legs were you standing on or who's, the famous phrase, we stand on the shoulders of giants, like that phrase. How have you come up with a solution in the innovation game, or have you come up with a solution in the innovation game to really democratize the reward for getting to an aha moment?
Yes, I think in the context of algorithms, we do have a solution. And algorithms can pertain to, all sorts of science. It could be in an area of fundamental science. So, maybe kind of particle physics, a lot of which they haven't necessarily found a practical application and they're not looking for one. They're just looking to sort of understand the basic processes of nature more effectively. And then you have, when people find breakthroughs in more practical areas, you can see how it might be a bit more, the market might take care of it. So if you find a way to sort of design a new and better drug or therapy for something, maybe you can patent that and sell it. It's a sort of a ready-made market for it. But I think what makes kind of science quite unusual and unique, at least academic science, sort of from the outside, is that a lot of these things that are discovered, you do get a lot of interest in looking at sort of basic physical processes and mechanisms. And these aren't necessarily monetizable. They don't even necessarily have an application, sort of in mind. And therefore, I think a lot of the reward is in sort of prestige. Also, if a lot of people use and cite your work, people do get sort of monetary benefits, but really in terms of additional grant funding. So they can employ more scientists and have more people sort of working on their thing rather than working on somebody else's program of research. And this is the kind of, this is where kind of science is different because it's known that it's so valuable downstream that it's worth investing in some sense, but it doesn't tend to be privately investable. And this is the reason why, it's left to governments. And governments have to do it because if they didn't invest in it, the private sector would not step in typically because of the difficulty in capturing value from things which don't necessarily even have a practical application. And then it wouldn't happen, and then the world would be a lot poorer, both culturally and monetarily for it, because we know just from experience that these things do tend to find application often in very unexpected directions, which might have nothing to do with the original field. And the countries that, the nations which sort of fund fundamental science tend to have sort of spillover from these discoveries downstream into kind of practical industry. And of course, the industry gets taxed. And this is where the government ultimately derives its revenue from that they can use to fund science. So I feel that the incentives in science are just very different. So it's more about sort of prestige, recognition. Of course, it is recognized that they generate sort of monetary value for the economy. But again, often it's hard to attribute. So what the prestige is for is really the ultimately, I would say, the kind of discovery of sort of understanding a mechanism. They don't, scientists don't generally tend to get adulation that they boosted the economy, not because they don't, just because it's hard to say that particular fundamental discovery led a lot later, sort of inextricably, to this practical thing. And all sorts of extraordinary subjects. I think Bertrand Russell's work on sort of pure logic that gave rise to the first sort of computer operating system, because they used a system of logic. But you can't really say that he foresaw that, or he was sort of a great, captain of industry. It just sort of happened to be that it found application. Somebody else found an application for it later on. So I believe that it's sort of, so it sounds all kind of very wholesome and noble that they're just sort of doing it for the recognition and the love of it. But I would say it's not necessarily so. I mean, I would say it's just a kind of another form of currency, another form of payment. And in fact, you see this in other places, like people who contribute to open source software, nominally for free. Often they want the sort of use of some software, which they couldn't get unless they sort of built on somebody else's contribution, and then they made it into what they wanted. And then because it's open source, they have the right to use it, and other people do too. So it's a different type of payment. It's payment in kind. So yeah, I guess that's sort of three very interesting paradigms, which are open source, academic science, and sort of more kind of practical industrial science, where that's sort of put into the melting pot, and we discuss those in the white paper.
But you guys are doing something different in the innovation game, right? So you have set up an ecosystem which, to my understanding, mirrors very much this, in-kind contributions. But you have also made it a closed system in the sense that anything that unfolds can then be utilized downstream. So like you're sort of being an intermediary between, scientific progress and licensing, and putting, backing up your IP with, I guess, legal documentation, essentially, to then, take that out to the market and say, look, we have something really valuable here. What do you think? And then also, to my understanding, is then you get a deal, and then this is how you make your tokenomics work in the innovation game, right? So that's how you cycle back the value and connect it to the outside world. Yeah,
that's right. So yeah, it just to sort of close the loop. So that in a sense, we have. So we know that, as I said, that all science, even kind of fundamental science, does seem to be investable in a sense. It's just that sometimes it's only investable by a government. And if you think about the reason why that is, it's because typically only governments, and not even all governments, ones that tend to be sort of governments of large countries and with sort of more developed technology industries, only they have the kind of range of interests which is necessary to sort of capture unpredictable spillovers from fundamental science. So if you kind of fund some fundamental science, and then you get a sort of spillover into, I don't know, maybe you were funding some particle physics and you find a kind of proton beam that can be used to kind of treat tumors, for example, then you might not be in the medical business, right? So you never kind of captured, you didn't have an application in the beginning, so you couldn't patent it. And then it was a very interesting invention. So some bright person looked at this and they said, oh, maybe it can be used for cancer, but it almost certainly wouldn't be your company, because you're in you're a particle physics company and not a sort of cancer and medical company. So this is the great difficulty in funding sort of the fundamental science on a sort of private commercial basis. But governments can fund it, and they can reliably sort of capture the value that it generates, assuming that sort of cancer therapy company, was sort of domiciled within their sort of jurisdiction for taxation. And this is really why they do it, not necessarily for the sort of love of science. They do it kind of for international prestige to some extent, but really that they do it because it's profitable. And the thing is about the innovation game, or more generally a a sort of a kind of international kind of a sort of a decentralized blockchain system is it can have a great diversity of interests. And the reason is because the challenges to the innovation game are really crowdsourced. So people all over the world can sort of, propose new challenges. We can put more in. So we have a whole kind of spectrum between, applied and more sort of fundamental pure areas. And then we can have this huge diversity. And so if you put a challenge in the innovation game, which is associated with some sort of fundamental kind of aspect of sort of scientific endeavor, and then, somebody, puts in a better algorithm for solving that challenge more efficiently, and somebody, says, oh, well, hey, my kind of MRI scanning problem or something could borrow that technique and use it. Then we can typically, that makes that particular challenge, this other challenge in this sort of unexpected direction, contribute some valuable IP in that area too. So we can, at least potentially sort of generate or capture value from sort of fundamental areas of computational science. And I believe that would be the sort of first entity other than the government that can really do that in a way that makes sort of commercial sense and is sort of privately investable.
So I think you brought up another really interesting point, and I think it's like an interesting, because it will be in both like the traditional sense, but also for the innovation game. And I know, of course, that you guys don't have like millions of projects on the go at the moment, but the current setup for traditional scientific or at least fundamental investments rely that the market can actually recognize the value, or that there is capacity to that it's discoverable in the sense that the right person will find it at the right time. And that is something that has just been sort of left to naturally unfold, if you will. And what you guys are doing is now you have a voting mechanism, which I read in the white paper. So you have kind of like an editorial process where you initially screen some ideas and then you put them out for voting. And that is a way for you to, I guess, have some filter, which is always necessary to have some policies or some filters in place. And then you leave it up to the community. But how then, do you already know initially, when you're doing the filtering process, that you think, okay, yeah, this is, I see the potential down the line. So you're already having the foresight to say this, you've already discovered it in a sense, and
Yep.
you know where it will go. So is that?
Yep. No, I think
okay.
I think I understand the question. I think that this is super important as well, because correct me if I'm wrong, but I think so. There's an issue is if the challenges are being sort of proposed, maybe that they can be suggested to a committee, and then they're sort of kind of proposed by the committee, and then we have a token vote to sort of elect the challenges into the game. Then almost that's sort of making a decision about what is going to be valuable and what is going to be, and so you would say that. Almost, if you could tell what was going to be valuable in beforehand anyway, and a committee could see that, then maybe there wouldn't be a problem in the first place. And I think this is certainly true to some extent. But another thing that I would say is quite striking is that, people observe all the time that the things which the economy tends to sort of remunerate and sort of consider very valuable don't coincide with the things that we sort of know to be important. And of course, there are things which turn out to be important, which people didn't suspect beforehand, and that's certainly true. But there's a huge amount of stuff which we do know to be important, which just still doesn't get remunerated, right? The economy doesn't consider it valuable. So a guy who wants to go and work on algorithms for sort of high frequency trading in Wall Street, might get paid $1 million a year, and a guy who wants to work on algorithms for sort of maybe kind of curing some sort of rare disease, or even sort of looking into some sort of fundamental aspect of nature in a particle accelerator, will not be remunerated to anything like that kind of extent. So what I would say is that human beings actually tend to be relatively good at identifying what is quote unquote important. These things that kind of move the world forward and would generate a lot of value for a lot of people if they were worked on, and that they should be worked on more. The question of how much more is a little bit more complicated, And they also sort of recognize things which is like, why are so many people going into, Wall Street and hedge funds? Maybe too many people are going into generative AI because, suddenly there's money in it. So I would say that, that there is an issue with sort of the fact that, maybe the challenge would never get in there in the first place unless we still recognize it as being important. But I think there's a lot of room to make things a lot better, if you see what I mean. Because there are so many things which, people kind of, that they know they should be worked on more, but it's just they can't figure out the sort of mechanism for getting that money other than asking the government for it. And that is really, that's a really kind of a sort of unfortunately, a very difficult way to get money. And it's quite limited. If you can spin it up and generate and capture the value yourself that you're generating thing and feed it back into the research, that's much better if that's possible.
Yeah, absolutely. Like I'm for the setup that you have proposed. I see that it has enough focus to like if you apply some filters or policy beforehand to say, okay, we decide that this is important, and it can be important for one or more reasons. So one, it can be, as you said, it can be fundamentally important for like the survival of the planet or individuals generally. The other one is that it could be important economically. And while those can be completely like separate silos, they can always, of course, and ideally have an overlap. And you can decide like what's the proportion of that you want to focus on, because obviously the innovation game is a business. And so you have to ensure that the tokenomics continues to work and that you do things that you push out ideas into the market that are readily received by the market. So that part needs to go. I completely understand that. When I first started coming into this space generally, like into the blockchain space, what I found really insightful as a scientist was this idea of putting out the policy in the first place and deciding initially, like if you're building a new chain or applications on the chain, you get to decide where the incentives lie. And so you can say, well, we're not going to reward someone from going into generative AI because that's overflooded and we don't need any more people. So we really want to put the incentives where they're actually needed.
Yes.
And I think the scientific community could benefit from knowing that the policies that are being put in place with a lot of these blockchain applications, the incentive mechanisms are much more noble, and they're geared towards, trying to fund the things that we really need. And it's not just funding things that are purely driven by economics.
Absolutely.
You need both.
Yep.
But that was a light bulb moment for me, that people are saying, no, we are going to reward the people that are working in the kindergartens much more than we were going to reward someone from saying, what color a logo should be. And I think that makes sense, right? And it's like our incentives right now are they're so out of whack. And we all know that they're out of whack. But the question is like, how do you bring it, how do you steer it back to something that, logically makes sense, even though we're, illogical from our own behavior. But yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny because I certainly didn't mean to say that we don't need that aspect of sort of wanting to do things in the right way, and that's sort of very valuable. I think the kind of analogy in my head is a bit like that they have this thing called the mathematical bridge in Cambridge, which apparently was designed by Isaac Newton, and the legend is that it was designed such that it could stand up without any nuts and bolts, but they put nuts and bolts in it anyway, maybe to stop the students from dismantling it or something. So it's sort of the analogy for that is that the innovation game should be able to run purely on people working to their own narrow economic self-interest. So these sort of more fundamental aspects of science, for example, should be there on their own merit, just for their own sort of economic gain. Because of this ability, we believe, to capture the spillover, because we can have such a wide sort of range of interests and sort of thousands of different types of challenges. But at the same time, we still certainly appreciate the value of kind of community and people who are sort of really on board with the project. They're doing it because they believe that it's a good thing, primarily. but they also, appreciate the value of earning a return from their investment, because then they have more money to invest in further research. So, if it's economically sustainable, and that, that kind of market mechanism often means that the resources are distributed more efficiently as well, rather than have sort of committees of people sitting there and sort of picking who should get the money, which is sort of somewhat more kind of corruptible, perhaps. And, there are kind of various reasons to believe that. And another sort of great example of this is in open source. So one of the things that the innovation team does is any sort of these algorithms that we receive, this innovation, there's always an open strand. So there's always it's available under a license, so you can use anything free of charge. There are some sort of data sharing obligations if you want to use it free of charge. But you can also buy your way out of the data sharing obligations if you sort of want to keep your data private. And there's a so-called commercial license, and that's what drives the demand for the token. But one of the sort of side effects of that is that because everything is open, there could be a chance of free riding. So people might sort of pick it up and just use it to process data and make their products, and then say, oh, I don't care about them. They're probably not going to sue me or something. I'll just sort of take the risk. But amazingly, we know from the example of open source, where sort of free riding, was thought to be a big potential problem as well, that there's very, very little free riding, especially in bigger companies with open source. And the reason is because the open source community is so strong that they have this kind of internalized ethic. And a lot of these people, they work for the companies. And my friend told me, in fact, one of our co-founders was a co-founder of Arm Holdings here in Cambridge. And he said if they suggested anything that they even perceived as being infringing an open source license, the engineers would threaten to resign. They would rather resign than infringe an open source license. And so it became more than just a sort of license. It became a sort of almost like a way of life. And this sort of, I believe that open source, like these people are all kind of working away, contributing to open source projects, in their spare time for free, typically. And I'm not going to do something which sort of undermines that. It will be against my sort of my kind of sort of way of life, the sort of what I consider is right. And so these sorts of this sort of, I guess, kind of camaraderie and cohesion, things which are beyond, that's definitely beyond just a sort of narrow economic self-interest, is incredibly valuable if you can get it. And we certainly do aspire to have something, of that sort, arise out of our project.
Yeah, I think the community and like how you have you have each other's backs, as you progress, and I think it's super admirable. And I was quite curious to hear your impression, because you've been exposed to this type of open source community for many years. But what about, do you see the same community in other scientific realms? So you have a background in mathematics and physics, right? So okay, there's going to be some overlap there, but when you were doing your PhD work, and how was the community? How did you find the community then?
Well, I would say that community is, it has a lot of similarities in the fact that people are very kind of intellectually curious. They can be sort of quite competitive between one another. And I think sort of on the whole, science tends to work well most of the time. But I think that when it doesn't work so well, it sort of has a kind of an outsized effect. And one of the things I sort of realized was there's a lot of it feels like people are often pushing against their own better judgment, or maybe compromising what might be their kind of core principles, for reasons of practicality. And I think that the reason is because necessarily, I think at the core of it is that, science needs money to run. Open source, kind of famously, a lot of people can contribute to it sort of in their spare time almost. And it doesn't really need sort of, kind of pecuniary sort of payment. But in science, you really do, because the equipment is expensive. It's so hard to be competitive if you're not a full-timer. You don't really have many part-time scientists anymore because they simply can't be competitive. And I think that it's that aspect, this sort of competition for grant money, which is quite scarce, which maybe tends to sort of, cause a bit of friction and not, necessarily drive people apart. But I would say it means that it becomes such an advantage to maybe sort of form a cabal, for example. Maybe people sort of end up all just citing one another's papers or something like that, to get sort of more citations. these sort of things kind of arise because they give such an advantage. And so it's really that, I would say, it's the kind of economics of the situation which is making it less easy for people to sort of be true to their own core values in science than it is in open source. That would be my sort of summary of the situation.
Yeah. So I 100% agree. I think scientists know it themselves and they struggle internally. Like, it's a conflict that many carry, and those that don't carry it, they should because they're completely oblivious of what's going on around them if they don't carry it. I was what I noticed too about the community, like, so I attended one of my first DeSci conferences. This is actually where I met you, right? Was the first DeSci conference that I attended. And we met because I just walked over and said, "Can I join your conversation?" And you were so receptive. Like, everybody, I didn't know who you were, or I didn't know the people that you were standing with. And I'm not sure that I would have been able to do that at like a classic scientific conference. And I suppose what I'm trying to highlight here is that the nature of the community is so warm and welcoming in this space that I didn't realize how much more relaxed I could have been at the very first conference. Like, I feel so much more relaxed now than I ever have, and I think, wow, like if other scientists could also feel that. And I think when you come into that space, you suddenly realize that you have so much value to bring, and that value is rewarded with other people being super curious about what you're working on, and why are you here, and usually, like, I don't know, maybe because the conferences that I've been to have been so, like, they've been really big and people come with different agendas, but that was my first impression, and that's how I met you. So it's like, yeah, and now we're here.
It's it's great. You're right. You are completely right that people just sort of wander up to each other, and if they do that, the other person's happy to talk to them, sort of thing. It doesn't feel kind of cliquey, or it did to me. I feel like, in fact, I was sort of around in the kind of very early days of sort of Bitcoin, and it's like around 2011 and 2012. And it was funny because I went to a few sort of conferences then, just sort of Bitcoin ones. And then I had a long break where I didn't really interact, in terms of conferences at least, with much to do with crypto. And then I sort of came back, and it again sort of went a bit bad. And then when I kind of got involved in DeSci again, it sort of felt fresh again and new again. And I think that the commonality was that everyone's in it for the right reasons. That whether or not they have something that's sort of practically viable, they definitely believe and want to create something that's practically viable. They don't want to sort of come up with some kind of money making scam. In fact, especially in decentralized science, people genuinely believe there isn't really much money in it. I think that's the kind of a perception. I think that probably end up being wrong.
That's a misconception. Yeah.
It's a misconception, but the fact that people believe that, it means that they only come for the right reasons now. So that's a sort of positive side effect.
Yeah, maybe we should keep it a secret then. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that tells too many people. But yeah, you're right. And I think it sort of goes back to a little bit again. I suspect, I'm not a sociologist, but I believe that in science, again, there's such a not kind of, I don't make any sort of moral judgments, just about this kind of mechanism that it benefits people a lot to form cliques and maybe sort of cite one another's work, and maybe sort of be sort of if there's a kind of a new upstart coming, maybe he should be sort of kind of excluded just in case he sort of steals a bit of our pie. And again, it's just the economics of it mean that if there ends up being a sort of benefit from that kind of way of behaving, then people will tend to do it. And the reason is just evolution. Because people who don't play that game, even though it might be slightly distasteful, end up leaving because they get outcompeted by the people who do. So yeah, you've just got to set up the kind of dynamics well at the start, which is kind of what we're trying to do. We're trying to kind of lay the foundations before it sort of gets too ossified and too difficult to change. But I think there's just a huge amount that can be done in that regard, because, I mean, for me, the core lies at the fact that, with a lot of this fantastic science, government funding is really the only way to get it funded. And there's, people talk about making things more privately investable, but there's a huge downside to that, is that the research tends not to be open, because the people who then, the private investors say, oh, you must capture the property rights from that, and then I want to keep it proprietary and exclude other people. And also you tend to get pushed to studying particular subjects, things that they think was going to have a more near-term economic sort of return. So this sort of more, trying to just understand the fundamental processes, tends to sort of take a back seat. So this has always been the sort of dichotomy with science. I think it's the core issue in the economics of science. And at least for algorithms, I believe, in the sort of way that I just kind of summarized, I think we might have found a way to overcome that. Because it's the government model. You just make things diverse enough so you can capture unexpected spillovers from more fundamental areas.
Yeah, I think you raise another valid point that, we do rely heavily on government funds to support fundamental research, and seems that the innovation game, will have some, possibilities for that spillover effect, because you are, encouraging fundamental developments, but still having, a longer term vision in mind that, okay, this may be relevant down the line. And so, of course, it's a more focused approach to making things discoverable. But we also need the other side, which is like, well, we don't know if this is going to lead to any economic gains, but we need to fund it anyways because we don't know what we don't know. And I think that's the simple premise of funding fundamental science.
Absolutely. It's a sort of like a very risky type of investment that currently only the government is sort of large enough to shoulder that risk and it be able to make economic sense.
Yeah. But that those funds are they're shrinking dramatically, and I think that's also why we see some of the other DAOs coming out, like the Vita DAO, and they have a really good business case, but the hair loss and psychedelics, there's all these smaller areas of science that are emerging within the crypto or blockchain space that are saying, hey, this is important. We need some funding, but we're also being overlooked by government. So that's another interesting branch that is kind of formed in this space as well.
Yep, absolutely. So I'll tell you. I mean, this might be a bit controversial, but I'll tell you my concern about some of these other things. I won't speak on any particular project. But again, I would love to. I'm very open-minded about this, but and I'd love somebody kind of to explain to me why my kind of. So, what concerns me sometimes is that, like, we know, for example, that a good way to you can do a lot of good, for example, by using money from lotteries, for example. So we have this thing, at least in the UK, we have kind of national lottery, and they fund a lot of good causes, and it's kind of interesting, this one, because there's so many aspects to it, like gambling, fair enough. Like it can be a legitimate form of entertainment. So as long as you don't sort of sell to under 18-year-olds or kind of encourage addicted people, then it's, maybe it's okay. And also it sort of has a negative expected return, right? Like if you bought 1 million lottery tickets, you'd expect on average to get less than sort of $1 million. So it's not an investment, right? Because investment should have a positive expected return. So you're going to sort of lose on average, but you do it because of the fun of knowing that you could get, a several million jackpot. And I think that this is completely legitimate, and some of the profit is used to fund good causes. And I guess I think that people in crypto who are trying to fund good causes have to be very careful that they're not a sort of less transparent sort of lottery. Because I would say that it's definitely the case that you could, get some of these tokens when you buy them, and you could become a millionaire, become a fabulously successful project. But what's unclear to me is whether they're a positive expected return investment, or are they like a lottery ticket? And I think that maybe the way that you sort of get to that is like you start to think about the underlying economics of it. And I guess you have to think about, like, if it is an investment, why doesn't a private investment do it, like without the blockchain sort of thing? Why don't they sort of set up just a company to do it? And sometimes they have things like DAOs, for example, and they might kind of have, you buy one of these sort of tokens and you get a way to sort of vote about how the money is spent. And so again, it's sort of like an investment fund, but it's controlled by the people who put the money in for the investment funders. Again, if they're kind of limited partners, or they contribute to an investment fund and people invest it. But the way that investment funds work traditionally, my understanding is that you have a sort of an appointed investment committee. You understand where the investments go, rather than the people who put the money in choosing where it goes. And again, my understanding historically is the reason why they work like that is because they did try some that worked the other way, and they tended to make less successful investments on average. So again, for any of your scientist people watching, I guess I feel like I kind of want to empathize with their skepticism. And just to say, like, some of these models don't make sense to me. My model also might not make sense to you, in which case, please feel free to ask more questions about it. So yeah, I guess just my wider point is just like, really demand answers. If it doesn't quite make sense to you, it might well be just because it doesn't make sense. It's not necessarily because you don't understand. It might be because you don't understand something or just missing something, but it may well just be because it fundamentally doesn't make sense. And people have good intentions. This was one of the things at the beginning of crypto. Like, at the beginning of crypto, they had all sorts of wonderful, weird ideas and stuff like that, kind of helping people and sort of funding things in, third world countries and so on. Now, fast forward to today, a lot of crypto and Ethereum is really just sort of Ponzi schemes and meme coins. And that's not because the people didn't have good intentions. It's just because their good intention projects didn't really make economic sense, and they ended up petering out. So this is one of the reasons why I think scientists are really important in crypto, because they bring this kind of skepticism and rigor.
Yeah. And I think they also, at least the people that I've worked with, our tolerance for error is far lower. So I guess that's skepticism. Like we're we like to be super sure that this is going to make money, or we like to be. So I think that mode of thinking, it's both good and bad, because the bad part is that we tend not to oversell and get super hyper excited. And I think a lot of investors and even in the VC world, you sort of have to exude that insane confidence that everything is just going to work out perfectly.
Yeah, that's a good point.
And I think that's where the personality conflict comes into play, because if you want the confidence, then typically that person is not going to be demonstrating some of those hype qualities. So we need to broaden our horizon on what we think constitutes hype, maybe, or.
This is a fantastic, So this is one of the reasons why I think that there is a considerable headwind for DeSci in particular, and I think you just hit on it there, because that hype and science tend not to mix. And a lot of people who are very good scientists tend to be kind of allergic to hype.
Oh, clickbait! We hate it. Like, the last thing any scientist wants to be part of is some clickbait blog post, that simplifies the findings far too much and makes claims that their peers are going to be like, did you really say that to the reporter or whoever? So the scientists have to balance their reputation, but you're right. We have an allergy to super hyped and clickbait titles because of the culture that is instilled. We don't want to be your dose of dopamine. We'd rather be in there for like the long-term learning effects rather than just the single hits. So,
I mean, I think that this is also why I have hope for DeSci, because I hope that more very skeptical scientists of that type will at least donate some of their time to try and debunk some of the things which don't make sense, and then it will be this sort of this is what the other areas don't really have. They don't have people kind of like cutting out the stuff that doesn't work at an early enough stage. And I think if we can get that sort of that system going, where some things which don't really kind of fundamentally make sense are weeded out more early, then that sort of evolutionary process. I mean, I can basically guarantee to anybody who's listening out there that the set of things which do work is not empty. So it is worthwhile trying to put in the effort to weed out the things which don't make sense, and then you will be left with something which does work. So it will be worth the effort.
Yeah, I was quite curious to hear, because you have walked in both worlds, and so you've been in the academic community and you've contributed there, but you've also been I'm really busy, setting up the innovation game. I believe you mentioned that you have 30 patents or something in the pipeline or done at this particular moment.
Oh, those, well, I probably have 30 granted patents. Yeah, these are sort of that was kind of in my sort of the later stage, more to do with distributed systems and computers and blockchain, in fact.
Yeah. Is that related to your academic work, or that's related to
No, that was after
game?
my academic work. Yeah,
that was after your academic work.
Working in industry.
Yeah. So you have been. So the point is, you've really been on both sides, and now that you've been on both sides, what do you think, people in like the crypto space or the blockchain space would find really striking to learn about the culture of, the scientific community? So we've already fleshed out that we hate hype and clickbait, and that we really value citation metrics. But, is there anything else that, now that you've put some distance between the two?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, I think the kind of scientific world, it's so funny. I think that it has more of a diversity of different types of people than any other kind of walk of life I've been in. So almost for these people who are like so nice, they even almost seem to be like, borderline angels, to people who are kind of like, very sharp elbowed and, never want to speak to you and this kind of stuff. It's amazing. And I guess it attracts all sorts of different types of people. Some of the most fantastic people, people are kind of on the autistic spectrum, but, incredibly kind of kind and insightful. It really is just like an amazingly diverse community. Another thing I think, sort of looking back on it, maybe I didn't really appreciate it so much while it was in science, is this sort of concept that they have this sort of, kind of internalized ethic, like norms of science. You may have heard of sort of Mertonian norms. And the fact that they sort of really do believe these things is quite amazing. The fact that things, work should be judged on its own merit, and the fact that, you should do things for the good of science rather for your own personal advancement. And although I feel like they don't always live up to these things in practice, I still feel like they want to. And to the extent that they don't or fall short, they sort of feel bad, like internally. Sometimes practical circumstances mean they have to kind of compromise it. But I feel like kind of at their core, scientists really do believe these things, that they should publish their work openly. They don't want to sort of, keep it secret or kind of make it proprietary so that people have to pay to use it. That's not just something that's coming from a practical point of view. It's like, it's sort of like an ethic. They feel that it is right.
Yeah, that's a super valid point, because I think that's where we're seeing a lot of issues also coming out of science now. So this idea that, you want to do good by society, you want to, deep dive, discover, because just that process alone brings so much joy. So you really enjoy the process, and, keeping things open. This is also what we want. And we have been doing that for so long, but somehow we're finding ourselves in a predicament where that process that we enjoy so much is in jeopardy because of other commercial drivers that have, emerged alongside of our deep work and focus of, producing science. And one of those drivers, as you know, is all the publication costs around keeping science open, and this idea that I shouldn't do it for a monetary reward. I'm not in it for the money. But there are people making money off of that, really like that internal feeling that we should keep things open. So I really feel that we are in some ways being taken advantage of, and we don't want to speak up and say stop, because then the alternative is that then we should demand that we get rewarded. And I believe that conflict needs to be resolved, and that scientists need to recognize that they do have value, and that value should be rewarded. And whether they want to take it as a personal reward is entirely up to them, or develop other types of mechanisms to make sure that those contributions come back to the scientific community. And I think that is also what attracts me most to the DeSci space, is that they're trying to find ways to, it's not just about making money, it's about making sure that funding continually is available to perform the research, which is why you have these smaller DAOs coming out with, addressing underfunded areas. It's why, your other, I guess even chains are looking at how can we democratize the reward system so that, it comes back into the scientific community. And what you're doing at the innovation game, which also stuck out to me, is that you're sort of democratizing access to be an innovator. So you're like, we talked about that scientists need to be full-time scientists, and you say with open science, with what you guys are working on, you don't actually have to do it full-time. So people can do it in their spare time. It's their hobby. They can balance it much easier. But you're also making it possible for more people to participate and to be an innovator.
Well, absolutely. Yeah, in our case, it's sort of a kind of a mixture of two things. Like innovating in our case can mean sort of tweaking the code to make the algorithm run more efficiently. And that sort of thing could be done by a sort of part-timer. I mean, people who optimize, software and work on open source, can certainly do that sort of viably. One of the reasons is that you don't necessarily have to even understand how the algorithm works or how it was invented, or even all parts of the code in order to optimize a certain section of it, which is very helpful. Another aspect, though, is if you want to invent a kind of a completely new algorithm, often that is such a hard thing to do that typically the people who come up with these things tend to be people who were working on it full time. They're sort of specialists. They're more than coders. They tend to be more kind of mathematicians, or sort of mathematical biology or mathematical chemistry, and those types of things. So there are different people who can contribute. Somebody who was working in academia and was lucky enough to have a salary could also contribute. And because the work is open when it's given to the innovation game, that you don't have to compromise this principle of the work being open. And it also means that other people can then immediately build on top of their work, which is much better for science and the progression of science. And it also sort of reduces the chance of monopolies falling, for example. Because if one guy has a sort of algorithm, they can be so powerful, then he doesn't share it with anybody else. This can end up being a sort of like a kind of very kind of concerning advantage, if it was being used for some kind of sort of practical application. I suppose that one thing that I forgot to really emphasize about innovation game that I would really like to emphasize is that there's a big danger at the moment of these algorithms going closed. And the reason is we've seen a great example very recently of the best sort of large language models, for example, are proprietary ones that are closed. You don't know what data's in them. You can't see the weights. They belong to sort of, OpenAI and Google, companies like kind of Anthropic who are funded by Amazon. And now, if you're an academic and you want to say kind of work on large language model research, for example, you can't do that if you can't see the model and you don't know what data went into it and so on. So they have to move into these companies in order to do cutting edge research, because otherwise they don't have sight of the thing which is the state of the art. And so again, they themselves typically, this is my experience of academics, they don't want to work for a big company. They don't want to say like everything that you studied, like you're not allowed to publish it openly. But if they can't even see what the best state of the art is, they can't build on top of that, and they're not really working at the coalface. And that's often something that for practical purposes, they say, I just have to compromise. I have to do that. And this is now true of LLMs, but when algorithms start being generated by automated processes, by kind of AI-driven processes, it'll start to become true of all algorithms. And you mentioned how concerning it is that, all the best MRI algorithms, they won't be open. The best algorithms that even tell scientists in sort of, traditional wet labs which experiments it might be best to do first. Imagine if that was, closed and locked up behind and it was owned by a company. Those companies would then be able to do more efficient research than universities can. And then even the people working in the bio labs in universities start migrating into the pharma companies, because otherwise they can't be at the cutting edge. And you start to get this sort of cascade where, people are moving into, industry, that it means their work's not published openly. It means they'll tend to work on more practical things than rather than more sort of fundamental low level things. And this is a great concern, which I think maybe people, they haven't really spotted it, because algorithms, like typically because of the fact that they're so hard to develop and the progress is sporadic, have often been developed within academia. but pretty soon they're going to be developed by AIs. And in fact, it's already starting to happen. And so this sort of this kind of culture of openness, I would say that's the biggest threat, is that people out of necessity, just because they want to have sight of the most up-to-date work, will start moving from academia into industry.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, you're 100% right. So we risk that, the publications that we see coming out today are really so disconnected from what is happening at the forefront, because of the way the funding mechanisms are the ones that we have available to us. But also I would argue that it's how we are putting out the science. So one of the things that I've considered, heavily is like, how can publishing on the blockchain bring, can that be a mechanism that we put into place that could mitigate, the issue and, the red flag that you just brought up? Is it possible for us to, when we want to keep things open, that it goes on the blockchain, there's a timestamp, we can recall it later, utilize it. Some people are focusing on, publishing data sets on the chain for that reason. But then the other part, of course, comes with, the whole DeSci initiative is, we need to get mechanisms in place that can continue to fund research so that the scientific community at large is the one that is actually at the forefront. So we're going to lose the talent. We're going to lose people that don't want to play the game. So the citation game, the I'm so famous scientist game, fund me, I get the biggest grant game, that has to disappear, because we are going to say, like, people are not interested. Like, I think people that really want to work on things that are at the forefront, they don't care about those things. But our current models focus on these, citation metrics, and I'm not saying they're completely useless, but they need to be revised, and we need to find a way to funnel that money back into the scientific community for the reasons that you just outlined. Like, there's all the fund is in private because you have the commercial application. If you want to work at the forefront, then you got to go private. I do see that, within the next 5-10 years, we'll really decide where we land on what side we're gonna end up on. Like, is it gonna be? It's so strange. I find that we have this desire to keep everything open, and yet we're allowing commercial drivers to like kind of just take it from us quietly, and we're going to end up like that wish to not care, or not say, okay, I shouldn't be rewarded. I should make sure that the journals are, paying for peer review, or I shouldn't, that there's a lot of funds that are being lost to the scientific community that way. We're just, propelling exclusivity. We don't even realize, I think, how much we're propelling exclusivity in private settings, because we just don't want to go into that internal conflict.
No, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, as well as the kind of driver that I mentioned, that may, for example, there might be more funding available in industry, or they might have the kind of sight of some sort of secret techniques that you don't get to even be aware of if you're an academic. I mean, there's also the sort of kind of the negative drivers, which are if we want people to stay in the academic world, we also should make it a bit nicer. Because the industry is trying to tempt people away with a lot of things, and so we don't really need to give them. They shouldn't give them any more ammunition, to say, we'll also be sort of kinder to you, and sort of let you have kind of more opportunities. But I think it's like you're right. There's some kind of perception of a relatively sort of shrinking pot, for academics, and in those circumstances, people tend to get a little bit more. Maybe kind of sort of less sort of charitable, and people tend to kind of, build even sort of tighter cliques than they have before. The issue of academic publishing, I mean, you're right. I mean, I wasn't even aware of the magnitude of the problem until relatively recently, the kind of scale of the profits that sort of some publishers make out of essentially sort of free labor, people doing reviews for free, which is essentially, kind of most of the value added that they seem to offer. it is funny because I suppose to larger companies, these sort of fees maybe that journals charge are just sort of just nothing to them. Maybe they don't even think about it. But for sort of academics, sometimes having to kind of pay to publish, or universities having to pay for the journals, it can be significant. And it seems to me, I mean, it's just electronic stuff, right? And it's true that you can't just do the review by some sort of electronic method. But then again, they're doing the reviews for free anyway. So it's kind of hard to imagine, like, why does it have to be so expensive? I mean, I suppose it's the kind of the premium that some certain journals can charge for their reputation. I guess that a lot of it must be accounted for by that. And that, I suppose that's a kind of a function of the very big role that prestige plays in science. So again, you can sort of contrast this with kind of crypto. Just going back to it, I mean, obviously, by far the most famous paper in sort of crypto was kind of original Bitcoin white paper, which I think has had sort of tens of thousands of citations. The author never revealed his true identity. It was never sent to a peer-reviewed journal. It's just stuck up on the internet. And this was all kind of like very antithetical to, I want to publish in Nature, science isn't good enough. It has to be in Nature. Then, my name will be associated with it. And, people will be kind of some appointed, kind of illustrious sort of reviewers will be sort of appointed to sort of pass judgment on the Bitcoin white paper. It seems kind of a bit absurd, it's right that the judgment was passed by the people who cite it and use it and talk about it, rather than someone else who might kind of have a famous name or was lucky enough to be a Nature reviewer, said that it was good enough. And again, this was more of the spirit of open source, I think. So they have sort of, open peer review and open source, and people kind of, contribute their work, and then people just sort of, anyone can pile in and make a comment, and your comment might be weighted more strongly if you have a sort of reputation associated with your name or your pseudonym. But it's not as if, other people can't comment, or if somebody has a particularly good comment, it won't be paid attention to. And it is funny, like, in some journals, I'm sure you've probably had the same experience. Sometimes I've read papers and I'm like, this stuff just seems wrong. And then it would kind of write to the author and they'd just be like, well, it got published, didn't it? And I was like, it's like, well, I mean, okay, so that means it's not wrong. Like, even though, why don't you address the argument rather than the sort of, try to, and I think, one of the reasons is probably because they're very kind of time constrained. But it's funny, like, if that happened in open source, right, they'd have to address it. Because, the thing is up there and, someone's going to sort of propose that your piece of code gets removed and updated with something else, unless you justify, why it is that this apparent flaw, sort of isn't actually a flaw. So that's much more of a sort of market-driven mechanism. And I know sort of market's a sort of dirty word, but in some ways it works a lot better if the incentives are.
But it's not just market, it's a merit-driven mechanism.
Meritocracy.
Right? So it's like the work has to stand on its own. And that originally was supposed to be how the scientific output should be as well, where you didn't have to worry about, all the frivels around it, that the work itself would stand on its own. And I think we somehow got disconnected from that. I know many scientists, as you mentioned, would love to publish in a prestigious journal. Some of those journals, they offer like a super rigorous peer review process. I know Nature and Science, they tend to publish, long lines of research rather than just like a single discovery. But I would argue that a lot of like research just needs to be discoverable. And we can see that is far more important because so much more knowledge is coming out on arXiv, which has not yet been peer reviewed. And people are going there first for their to stay up to date on what's coming out. Like, they're not waiting for the journals anymore. So we're actually seeing a shift in where the value lies. And I think that's why I'm really excited about the DeSci space, because they're saying, well, we have an opportunity now to decide and properly recognize where the value is. Not where something, not where the, like, it doesn't, it's not about being published in Science. That's not the value. If just because you publish something in Nature or a super high ranking journal doesn't mean that particular work is going to go on to be, uptaken by society, or it's going to like spark a new company or whatever. That there's no, of course you have more eyes on it, so you can enhance the finding of it, but there's so much going on in other like institutions, smaller research groups around the world. And I would argue that there is more economic drivers that are coming up from like the smaller journals than the big ones. So that's just, I'm putting it out there. I would love it if someone tried to like took the challenge to prove me wrong. But if I had to put my money on it, I would say that like a lot of products and services that come to market are coming and stemming off of, scientific findings that are not being published in the most prestigious journals.
Yeah, it is fascinating. And I keep on drawing the analogy with open source, but I guess I also feel like I should sort of emphasize that I do understand that it really is just an analogy. That the thing is about scientific publishing in more generally, the kind of things that go in nature and so on, is the problem is a lot harder. So one of the reasons, again, like with open source, like somebody has some code, and if you have the code, you can sort of run it, you can see whether it works. If you think there's something wrong with it, you can sort of run it in a particular way and say, hey, this thing happens, which shouldn't happen. In science, it's harder. You could rerun the experiment. You could say, oh, it went wrong. And they could say, oh, you didn't do the experiment properly. Or maybe you did do the experiment properly, because it's hard to do. Like code is able to be, by its nature, replicated sort of precisely. Whereas with science, it's either not or it's difficult to do, right? And it's difficult to do in a way that you've sort of provably done it in the correct conditions. So I think that there is, there is hope to make it a bit more like this kind of more open model. But again, I guess I just feel like I should really acknowledge that it is still an unsolved problem. There are a lot of aspects which make it a lot harder than open source.
Yeah, and that's why I was really interested in the economics of like the ecosystem that you're setting up. And because as you mentioned, like if it's something like algorithms or code that you can run and test to see if it, runs faster, or it's, it's more clever with some other type of metric that you use to proxy that. With a like behavioral study in science, like we actually need people to do replication studies to see if it is a generally true finding. Most studies, I think the statistic is really high. Don't hold me to it, but it's like 70% are like, we can't replicate 70% of the science that's out there. So, we already hold so little knowledge in our head at any given time, and to think that 70% of that is actually wrong also,
yep. that's right.
It's a little bit ridiculous, right? Yeah.
Absolutely. And, there are more kind of remarkable things like, although it is in general a harder problem, this sort of science than, a lot of these more computer-based applications, it's still true that in a lot of, computational science papers or science papers that contain computer methods, they don't even include the method. They don't include the code. So that's one space where there is really no excuse, right? Because although you can't include your own sort of knowledge and know-how so that someone could replicate an experiment in a lab, you could always include the code. And a lot of time they don't do that. So it just shows that there is an issue. It's not just because the domain is more complicated, although it is. There's also an issue of kind of like culture and the fact that it's sort of considered acceptable not to include your code. It's like, how did the reviewer know that it was right? I mean, the reviewer could have tested the code if it was included in the paper. So it seems strange that they don't request it. So, it's a bit, you kind of have to wonder whether it's just a sort of, maybe it's kind of like laziness, or, how it's possible to have a culture that doesn't, demand that you at least give everything that you possibly can to make it easier for the reviewer or a bystander to replicate your results.
Yeah, well, I think this is where the peer review comes into play again, because now we're getting to the point where scientific discoveries are multidisciplinary. They rely on data sets that have been collected in a particular way. They rely on the temperature of the day in the lab. There's just so many other factors that can alter and add noise into an experiment. Having someone that is aware of all of those nuances when you make a peer review, I think that is also going to become more scarce in the future. So this idea that, as you mentioned here, like how do we implement that rigorous peer review? How do we say, well, this person is going to test the code? Well, I mean, don't give it to me. I can't test the code because I can do something else, but that's not what I'm going to do. So that means we need me and another person and then another person. So what we're ending up with is, a peer review team that is bigger and, more specialized individually if we're going to implement a rigorous peer review process. And I don't think that we're equipped with that right now. Currently, I don't know how we do it now. I think we accept 2 or 3 reviews. They tend to be more on like flow and soundness and logical arguments. Did they use the right statistical method? Are the claims valid based on what the data sets are showing or the graphs or the results? So then you can run your peer review. But moving forward, like the problems are bigger. How do you vet that? And I think that maybe at some point we're going to need like professional peer reviews, like people that specialize in vetting. So like, as you said, test the code. Like, can we give it to this person? They're completely objective. They don't care where you're from, what your background is. They don't, they have a very specific task. When you give me A, does B happen? And that is their job. And I think in order for that to happen, and maybe some people in the scientific community are like, oh God, we could never go that way. But in order for that to happen, because I do see it as a future need, we do need to find a way to reward the peer review in order to make that a financial, like to make it a viable outcome. So as you mentioned, like back in the day when people published results in one lab, they would publish it so that the other lab could reproduce it. That's what happened. We had that ping-ponging effect and people would verify the findings. That doesn't happen anymore. We don't verify findings. We just say, okay, I'm gonna make something better. I'm gonna just keep moving forward. But maybe moving forward is a bit of an illusion if we don't verify or run the rigorous.
Yeah, absolutely. There's also incentives to sort of, you imagine to kind of hide your methods in some sense. Like you want to be the one who was sort of, kind of got the timestamp that registered in history that you were the first person to do X or discover Y.
Yes.
So somebody else does this later, you could say, it wasn't anyone else, I was the first one.
And that's where blockchain comes in.
But to the extent that, that will be credited to you because you said that this happened, then you're sort of incentivized to give away as little information as possible, really, because then otherwise people can catch up with you. And you're less likely to get the next, there might be then your competitor might be more likely to get the next sort of big groundbreaking discovery. So the fact that the incentive is to make it sort of hard to replicate or just sort of, limit the information, don't make it easy to replicate, let's put it that way, is also kind of troubling, especially because the reviewers are probably going to be your competitors. My understanding is, I haven't sort of verified this, but somebody told me that in the more early days of journals that a review was done by professional editors. So they didn't have sort of recruit the kind of sort of other people to do it.
It was only done by the editor. That's like, first it was put out to societies, right? So you had you presented your result at a conference, which was the society. And then you would handle questions from the audience. Like you would have a conversation, like a real conversation. And then I think it migrated to, science started to pick up speed. And, then we had the printing press became more available. And so we started to hand our findings to an editor. And that editor would basically decide if you would go in print, and then it would be communicated. So it was just usually one person.
Yes, no, that's right. Who were a specialist really at assessing, kind of the credibility of science in this particular field.
So now we need to replicate that one person, right? That is the peer review, right? So we need to replicate, but now we need more siloed and more specialized reviewers on a specific topic paper, potentially.
Oh, indeed, yeah, more multidisciplinary. It sounds sort of doable to me, though, and I guess if you calculated how much money people give for journal subscriptions and maybe even to publish, you could probably pay these guys $1 million a year or something, and you could have sort of like a team of 5 people assessing it. It's you know what I mean? Like, I think that it sounds kind of unviable, but if you did the sums, it probably wouldn't be. That's my strong suspicion. And also it's yeah, so I think it is kind of amazing that, you know, peer review did work in a very different way, you know, in kind of relatively recent times. It reminds me a little bit of the patent system. We have patent examiners. What they work in a particular area, they'll get a patent in a particular field, and you give it, and they decide whether to grant it, whether it's, you know, has kind of prior art, or whether it's sufficiently novel. And if it is, they may grant the patent. But of course, they're just professional examiners. That's all they do for a job. They're not inventors on the side, you know. And imagine if sort of patents were assessed, like, you know, Apple's patents were assessed by the guys that work at Samsung or something. They probably never grant anything, right? Unless there was some kind of, like, you know, they were friends or you got a kickback or something. And that to us, that would seem ludicrous, right?
Yeah.
But yeah, that's
what's happening in the scientific community. That is funny. I never really looked at it that way, but it does add a new spotlight on to how the peer review is done today. And we do have the numbers available to us, so we know that, you know, I think there was a recent publication that came out that estimated that for like an initial review, it costs the scientific community around 12 or 1300 USD. And that's for like a few hours of work to go through it. That's one person, right? So, and then if you multiply that by, you know, how many articles are coming out every year, like, you know, being published, and in addition to that, you also consider how many that didn't make it past the peer review process. So like the rejected manuscripts, you know, then you're looking at, you know, numbers close to 6 billion USD that are being diverted away from the scientific community. And that's like, when we talk about not having enough funding, well, what if we just, you know, we could just take a fraction of that and push it back into the scientific community? And that is where, you know, we really need to figure out how that reward mechanism should be put into place. And then at the same time, if you can couple that with some of the other advantages that blockchain has, like, for example, the timestamp, and, you know, even looking at what you're building in the innovation game, where you have found a way to reward people along the way. Like, as you get closer to a solution, at least if I understand it correctly, you have found a way to reward people to keep contributing. And so when something unfolds, then, you know, it comes back to the community again that help get it to that position. So there is like many parallel cases, like you highlight Apple versus Samsung, what we know sound ludicrous, and maybe that's the case that we need to communicate to the crypto people that would find, you know, the scientific culture very striking. And we also have examples of other mechanisms that are working. And you guys are working, right? Like, you are having success at the innovation game. Like, you have quite a few patents. How large is your community now? And
so, yeah, a great question. So we've only been doing sort of like strong kind of community, well, I would say community, to sort of public outreach for, in fact, a very, very short time. I think maybe it's less than 6 weeks that we've been actively going out and trying to kind of get people to play it. So in that time, we've had I think we've had sort of more than 30 algorithm submissions so far for the challenges that we have. So we have 3 challenges in at the moment, which are something called SAT, Boolean satisfiability. This might not mean much to people who are not computer scientists, but they're kind of classic computer science problems. There's another one called knapsack, one called capacitated vehicle routing, which is something like the traveling salesman. And we're going to bring in sort of vector similarity search, which is to do with vector databases, and something called hypergraph partitioning problem, which is has an application in parallel computing, making it more efficient for sort of load balancing. So we're sort of, you know, we're loading up the challenges at the same time as getting kind of algorithmic contributions for more efficient types of algorithms. The sort of miners, or the so-called benchmarkers that we have, sort of use those algorithms to perform proof of work. So that's really the market signal that we have, which is used to decide which ones to remunerate. Which, by the way, is the idea of what algorithm is the fastest or the best is in fact, when you think about it, it's a very kind of slippery concept. So this is one of the challenges that we had. You could run it on your computer and say, oh, it's faster. But what if someone runs another algorithm on their computer and say, oh, that one works better on my computer? Or if one is much faster, but it only runs much faster on a special type of computer, which is very expensive. So it's like, should that be rewarded or not? Because it's better in some sense, but it's not better because nobody has that type of computer that can run it. So that our kind of insight for that, just stepping back, was to say, just leave it to the market. So because it's used to perform proof of work, we just say whichever algorithm the benchmarkers are adopting the most is the one that deserves to be rewarded. And they choose their own hardware. They self-select. So they'll say, is it worth me buying this more expensive hardware because I can get more tokens in the innovation game more efficiently, somewhat like Bitcoin miners. So that's just a bit of an aside. But there does, the proof of work aspect of it does seem to really capture people's imaginations. One of the big, one of the very tangible successes we've had, along with all of the algorithms being submitted, is we've had a sort of huge upsurge in people running their computers to do this sort of benchmarking process, which is the process which assesses the algorithms. And the cost to mine one single TIG token has gone from about 1 cent per token to about 50 cents per token over the past month. So I guess that's a measure of how much effort some people are willing to put in to acquire our tokens. So it's kind of flattering, but also it's a little bit shocking. Like I don't know, but yeah, we're very sort of happy to have had this sort of explosion of interest. We suspect there are some big people who were traditionally crypto miners have come in with their computers and started to turn them towards the innovation game. But that in turn has attracted sort of more innovators. Again, we have it on reliable information that the most successful innovator, though, is a guy who works for a hedge fund. So he's making the better algorithms.
He was probably a former scientist that said, I'm gonna go and work at the forefront, so I'm gonna leave academia.
This is probably my old kind of like scientific, sort of kind of attitude coming in. But probably, if I had to choose, I'd probably rather the tokens go to somebody who wasn't already rich, like this guy at the hedge fund, I presume is. But still, it's fine. We take all innovation from any quarter, basically. Yeah. So it might be a sort of recovering scientist who's thinking of, he wants to work on science again. Exactly. You kind of got tempted into the world of money, and now he can have both at the same time.
Yeah, because the journey, right? The discovery of making something work, or revealing something that we didn't know before. I think that it's really hard to put a monetary value on that process. It's how you live, right? That is what I think most of us will look back on one day. So, you have the innovation game, and you have background in physics and mathematics, and I'm quite curious to know, though, like out of all the other niches that you could pick within the scientific arena, are there others that you are like particularly excited about? So I know that you love the innovation game, so that's not even a candidate for this answer, but are there, like, what is getting you really excited right now in terms of like where science is progressing?
So I would say one of the things that's getting me really excited and at the same time slightly concerned is AI. So I'm interested in AI safety. I'm interested in applications of sort of AI, to science, of course, as a lot of people are. But I also am concerned, which it seems to be relatively niche, that the AIs could one day cause a problem for people. Not necessarily because they become sort of malicious or don't like us. It's really just because they start to maybe squeeze us out, just as we as humans have squeezed out so many sort of animal species. And many of them, maybe we've driven many animal species to extinction without ever even knowing that they existed, if you see what I mean. So I guess what I'm trying to put forward is it doesn't really require it's like, why would the AI care about us? It's not going to kind of send Terminators out to kind of kill people, and they won't have sort of the negative traits of people, maybe, that we're sort of, we want to kind of rule over other people to show how important we are, or maybe we have sort of, kind of malicious, jealousy and all these negative things. To my mind, it needn't have any of that stuff. It could simply, cause people harm or limit their potential sort of as a side effect to whatever it is, in fact, focused on. So, yeah, I would say that kind of, that's sort of been an area of great interest to me. It is science, but it's also sort of, kind of an area of philosophy, I think. kind of somewhat related to ethics, somewhat related to kind of, economics and game theory. So that's, I don't know if you've read into this subject, but I think it's
Yeah, I have actually, and I've been listening to actually other people's, opinions and impressions of where we're going. And something that sort of stuck with me was this idea that if we got to a point where, you have this, sentient type of AI, it really will come down to whether or not we are a nuisance to it. So, if we raise ourselves to a point where, we could limit its progress, then I could see that it would, do something to harm us. But the point that you're bringing out is also the possibility that it could squeeze us out unknowingly. So that in some way is a bit of a conundrum, because if it does get to the point where it can squeeze us out, it should be at a level of, I don't know if intelligence is the right term here, but it should be at a level of awareness, let's say, that we do exist. So I think it really comes down to what we do, and how we manage the situation. But I also see the possibility that, we have been remarkably, adept at building instruments that augment us. Like, I have my headphones on, you're wearing your glasses, I have access to knowledge just behind me. So all of these, whether or not, they don't have to be connected to us to augment our performance, but will we really start outsourcing our creativity? And I think that is maybe also what you're getting at. Like, will it squeeze out our value for being alive, like for existing? That I think is an interesting.
Absolutely. I mean, it is certainly a danger. I mean, there's many different types of risks and dangers. For like quite extreme ones, which I mentioned, to sort of kind of much more questions of whether we find sort of value or whether we believe what we're doing is important. My own personal view is that what we do people do will always be important, at least in some quarters, to some other people. In the same way, there were sort of interesting stories that when they kind of invented this sort of quartz watch, all the people in Switzerland kind of shut up shop and said, our watches were the most accurate, but they're not anymore. So, we can't compete. So we just shut down. And they were sort of almost surprised when people still wanted to buy the mechanical watches, even though they were less accurate, because they had kind of mechanisms in them, and they felt sort of that they were kind of valuable things created by human hands. So they still had value. And so sort of, I do believe, and the best chess player, Magnus Carlsen, still kind of like a superstar and probably, a multimillionaire, kind of very deservingly so, even though he's much worse at chess than a computer program which could just run on my laptop. So I think it's because, that we sort of imbue value to things which other human beings can do. So in that aspect, although, not everybody's job is like that, there's certainly, I should imagine that kind of more jobs could become like that. It certainly would enhance our abilities. You are right. So we would become more effective, even at the sort of very kind of practical jobs that we do, if we have sort of computers, helping us. And I guess the question would be that, at some point, could it be that we're slowing the computer down? So the computer wouldn't be helping us. Then we'll transition to where we're helping the computer. And then it will be that we don't really need, the computer doesn't need our help at all, because we can't think or move quick enough in order to be sort of meaningfully contributing to what the computer does.
But then I think also you kind of touched upon a point about craftsmanship, right? When you talked about the watch. So then it becomes like what becomes important to us. And depending on how AI, is like unfolded and like how it unfolds in our world, it might come down to how much we master our own self. So I think like that comes back to the craftsmanship. So we marvel at the like how we were able to put something together mechanically to do something that could approach, really, really, accurate computations that are run by a computer. So we marvel those feats, and maybe more value will be given to to us overcoming what would otherwise be considered our, the limitation of the human being. So in that sense, as long as AI develops alongside us as a tool that frees up our time in order for us to master ourselves, and I think many of us have had some, existentialism thinking. I'm not an expert in quantum computing, but I feel like we have that capacity at the level of physics. So we have cells, and you keep going down, 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 down. So we go into that probabilistic nature of really not knowing what is going to be the outcome, right? So we have that, and we have been able to capture that. Like our whole organism, our whole self has captured that. Yeah. Now it'll be like, can we reflect internally, and maybe we will have other sorts of augmentation, like that help us get to that level. So I think, some people talk about the land of abundance if AI, takes over and we have everything at our disposal. So then what will be of interest to us at that point? And I really do think it's about mastering ourselves.
Oh, you're absolutely right. I mean, I do think you make a great point with craftsmanship. I think often it's sometimes if you look at a painting, if somebody just tells you that it was a real painting painted by somebody, you see it in a different way. And you naturally kind of accredit more value to it. And I think kind of quite rightly so, but because it took effort to produce, and it was produced under constraints. We know that it's quite difficult to paint as a human being. It's harder to paint a nice painting than it is maybe for a computer or sort of a robot to do it. And also, that like the great chess player, like he has the constraint that he's playing chess, but with a human brain, of course, and we appreciate that. And I think sort of doing things under constraints, even if they're not things that are traditionally considered as art, as soon as you start to do them, but with constraints, they sort of become art, because it's sort of it's like, I don't know, like a kind of haiku, or someone who builds a building on a kind of a difficult site or something. It always sort of brings out the best in people because they have to sort of overcome this sort of limitation. And human beings at least appreciate that. Maybe if a robot, all it cares about is the end result, how precise it is. But a person will care about, how difficult it was for the person to achieve that end result.
Yeah. And the solution, like how did they arrive at the solution? Like how did the creativity unfold in that scenario? And I think that's where, I guess, the whole quantum aspect comes into play. But I think, it will be quite interesting to see how we will, where we'll place our future value if AI does ascend to such a magnificent height. And regarding like what it would value, I mean, we know that it's whatever we tell it to value. So whether it's accuracy or like speed or...
No, I think you're right in that.
I don't know how you would program creativity. Like what would be a proxy measure for creativity?
So this is a great question. I think one of the issues with AI, I think you're absolutely right. It will value as its kind of terminal goal, as its sort of core goal, what it is that we sort of compute into it. And it's an interesting thing about sort of terminal goals. This is where the sort of philosophy came into it. I was watching a great series of YouTube videos about this. And if you have a goal, a goal, no matter how absurd, and they always use this kind of example of, create as many paperclips as you can. A sort of an AI, no matter how intelligent it gets, it's not going to say, okay, I'm going to sort of reprogram my goal to something else. Because sort of by definition, if you change your terminal goal, this sort of ultimate one, then you're less likely to achieve it. So it's, and so you never want to alter your terminal goals. They're not based on some sort of rational, they're not there sort of, because you thought that they were the best things to do. They were there because you thought that whoever created you with the best terminal goals to have in there, and then the sort of the agent itself will not care to have them changed. And in fact will resist somebody else who wants to change them, even if they are being destructive and having sort of negative side effects. So I think what it means is that we have to be very careful about what we program into super intelligent and therefore super capable and super powerful AIs as their goals. And I think one of the core problems is that we don't really know what even our goals are, let alone, kind of other people's. We think they're X and they end up being Y, and it's quite complicated what humans want. And it's sort of, so it's not very well defined. And there are some ideas that maybe we could use an AI to try to extract out of from us what it is that we really want, because we're, even we ourselves don't really know it. And it has to be kind of dead on, because otherwise it will sort of work well for a while. It's like King Midas. Oh, this is fantastic. I've got more gold than I ever had. And then it sort of starts to go a bit bad, right? And then but because the thing with the terminal goal is so powerful, it might continue to pursue that goal and sort of bat us away if we try and say, oh, hey, actually, we changed our mind. We want you to have a different goal because now we realize it's becoming destructive.
But don't you think, like, in order for it to ascend to such a level, it really depends on what we connect it with?
But we're connecting it to everything, unfortunately.
Oh, yeah. Okay, I see what you mean. Yeah, of course. And when you think about how things are...
So there's kind of issues like, if someone's scared that their neighboring country might try and invade them or something, if you let the AI be in control, you say, hey, the humans aren't even going to be in the loop. It can make decisions so much faster than a human can. And so it gives you a competitive advantage, unfortunately, to put it in control of more and more stuff. So that's a concern.
Yeah, I see your point. Yeah, but it still comes down to what we connect it with. And
yeah, absolutely. So safe AI could be built, but the concern is that it won't be because of...
But this is like two different scenarios. So one is saying, like, the AI, if we give it a lot of information and we allow it to take decisions on our behalf, it could choose the wrong one. That's a possible outcome. The other one is if we build it to a point where it becomes sentient. That's a different outcome. They are not the same. They are different tangents. I mean, and they're not mutually exclusive either, but it's just one where we talk about sentience and like general intelligence, and the other one is about, giving too much power to something that doesn't understand its own consequences.
Yes, indeed. So you're right. They are very different. I think maybe a good analogy would be that, maybe like a virus could kill all of the people. It's not sentient, but it's very powerful, and it will kind of replicate and spread itself. So an AI could be built that is very dangerous, which is like that. So not necessarily sentient, but just powerful enough to sort of pursue some single-minded goal that doesn't make sense to such a degree that other things start sort of, being damaged, and we can't really stop it. And the sentient one is, at least we could reason with it. We can't reason with a virus.
Who knows if we could reason with it? I think that's the big question.
No, indeed. It may not be receptive to that reason. Yeah.
Maybe we don't even have logic. We just think that we're logical. Who knows?
Well, no, you're absolutely right. It's hard to know how it would perceive us, whether it would bother to sort of expend too much time worrying about what was good for us rather than what was good for itself, and maybe its other fellow AIs. Maybe it would just sort of prioritize its kind higher than it prioritizes us. It's very hard to know.
Yeah, but that's what our genetic code does, right? At its essence. So it's like, I think that's a really interesting, like, something to unfold, because if we believe, or at least describe a scenario where AI says, oh, well, I see value in like replicating myself, or I see value in connecting with other AI and sort of, building a community in the way that we understand a community, then that actually replicates our like the fundamental drivers of our being, which is, our genetic code. And actually, like many years ago, Richard Dawkins wrote a truly fascinating book called The Blind Watchmaker, and I think you'll find that interesting. And then he also had some sequels to that where he talks about the selfish gene. I think that's the title. And it really follows this, is the universe deterministic? And, what is the driving mechanism of why we exist? And one of them is that, we're just here to replicate our code. So if we apply that to AI, then I think we're just a fundamental of the universe.
Oh, we certainly are. Yeah.
We're just an outcome of a fundamental rule or law, or yeah.
No, you're right. Yeah. So I think you're right. It's kind of deeper than ethics or human values. When we realize this is what kind of gave rise to it all at the lowest level, it's sort of, in one way it's disappointing, but then you realize it's just a much more fundamental level of nature.
Yeah, like we're extremely elaborate versions of our genetic code. Like it's so incredibly, it's laughable. It really is laughable. And yeah, Well, I encourage you to check out those books. I think they're still super relevant today. And I think if you will direct me to the YouTube series that you've been watching, because I'm quite curious to hear like other people's opinions on that.
Oh, absolutely. I'd be very happy to. Yeah, it's funny. There's a guy called Robert Miles. So he was the one who talked about the sort of philosophy and stuff like that. And it's funny. I watched it for so long, but I didn't believe in it. Like I thought it was as interesting as that intellectual exercise. But I thought no one's ever going to build one of these things, right? And then ChatGPT came along, and I was like, oh, actually, this is a little bit concerning. And they seem to be getting better and better. So now I think that his philosophy may become practical sooner than we might have thought. I'll absolutely share that with you then.
I have like this is just completely off topic, but I know that your background is in cryptography. So are you like have you been following the updates on like the advances in quantum computing and how that is purportedly causing some people on the crypto blockchain space to get a little bit fidgety in terms of and is this something that you know a lot about? Because I was actually planning on like trying to host a podcast where I have a couple people on the topic come in, and I don't know enough to speak the language, but I would love to host something where other people do.
Yeah, right. So, I mean, I'm certainly not a quantum cryptography expert. I did study quantum mechanics quite a lot as a physicist, and then completely separately, I studied cryptography and computing, but classical cryptography and classical computing. So I kind of know a little bit about the two things, but quantum computing, as you probably know, is like doing a different sort of computing which uses the properties of quantum mechanics. So at a kind of high level, I understand what they're attempting to do. I do have some skepticism about quantum computing. So I think that quantum computers, may well be able to be built. My understanding is that they haven't built a quantum computer yet which can do anything which a classical computer cannot do just as well or faster. And this is a really interesting, I think anyway, kind of sort of it speaks to a little bit about the kind of the scientific method, because what they've been doing is, so they have these quantum algorithms that they know could do sort of useful stuff like, factor large prime numbers, which will be useful in cryptography, or do sort of other kind of, very quick search algorithms for databases. And if you could build a quantum computer that did this, it'd be fantastically valuable, just, practical applications, something you can do sort of much faster than you could do before. But these aren't the types of algorithms that they're trying to implement in the quantum computers that they're trying to build. The reason is that these algorithms are more complicated, and they're like, okay, we need to learn to, kind of walk before we run. So what we're going to do is implement another algorithm which does this other thing, which isn't of any practical use at all. It's the point of this algorithm is to show that there is at least one thing, even though it might not be a useful thing, that a quantum computer can do a lot faster than a classical computer. So when they've achieved that, they say they have this kind of notion of quantum supremacy, which proves, like beyond a shadow of a doubt, what they're trying to do, that a quantum computer has been built in the world that can do something that no classical computer can do, albeit a useless thing, right? So what they keep doing is they keep on finding these algorithms to do these useful things, and they're actually kind of crafted to try and make them easier to run on really small, really kind of quite early stage quantum computers, kind of well. So that's the algorithm is crafted to the application rather than the other way around. It should be. And so what they keep on doing is they keep on finding these algorithms, running them, saying, oh, we got this result in this amount of time, which is a lot less than a classical computer can do. But then a few years down the track, or sometimes even just a few months, they find an algorithm such that that a classical computer can achieve the same result faster than the quantum computer did. And the reason why this keeps on happening, in my view, is that, so say it was one of these database search algorithms, or one of these sort of useful ones, kind of like factoring prime numbers. So because that is a useful thing, by definition, that human beings want to do, very smart computer scientists have spent many decades trying to find algorithms for classical computers that can do this faster. So basically it means there are very highly optimized versions of algorithms or classical computers to do this particular task. And you can see they kind of get faster and faster, and then maybe there's sort of increment, but people are trying to push them forward because they're so valuable. And so what it means is we have a quite high confidence level for these applications because they're practical, that we know efficient, pretty competitive algorithms to do them. because these other algorithms are just invented as a contrivance for the quantum computer to try and sort of show that it's better at a classical computer, nobody has even put in any attempt to optimize these things for a classical computer. No sort of serious attempt, because why would they? Because they have no practical relevance. So what they do is, again, I'm a bit of a skeptic. This is a bit of a trick. They come out with this paper saying it's 100,000 times better than any known algorithm can do it on the classical computer. But what they forget to mention is that nobody's even tried to make it faster on a classical computer, because this algorithm has no relevance in the real world. But as soon as they bring this big paper out and say, we claim quantum supremacy, suddenly there is a motivation to try and optimize on a classical computer, because then you can debunk this big paper that was previously, and everybody will cite your paper as the one that debunks it, right? So there's this kind of back and forth of big claim debunked. And in my knowledge, this has never really happened in science before. Never have so many extremely ambitious and confident claims by top scientists been debunked so many times as they have for this quantum supremacy issue. And that's the reason why, because they're trying to do it with a contrived algorithm, which no one has any motivation to try and optimize until the big claim is published.
Yeah, I was unaware that they are building the tech base off of a predetermined algorithm, like a designed.
Yeah, algorithm is just specifically invented to try and prove that quantum computers are better.
Yeah. Okay. So that would be, yeah. So in science, you would never do that, right? Like you would set up an experiment to, yeah. Okay.
And again, but it would be great. I mean, this is why it's good to have these things on. I mean, maybe I'm wrong, right? I could be wrong about this. I mean, but I do kind of keep a reasonable track of it. I would just love.
Well, I think it's definitely a conversation I would like to resume, because when I came into this space, and I was super excited, DeSci, and okay, I really understand now the tech. At least I think I do. And then someone dropped this, like, quantum computing is going to take over blockchain, or it's going to cause blockchain to have to evolve really, really fast in the next 5 years in order to, mitigate security risks. And so I was just like, whoa, like, well, I just got here. And now people are freaking out. So I just thought, well, maybe this would be a really good topic, because I think a lot of other people don't understand. And I'm looking to put together a panel discussion about it. And, we have the clip that we have now, but I think, bringing in other people and getting their opinions on it would be, it's something if you would like to join.
An actual expert, unlike me. But I would say that if you are speaking to experts, if they are working in the field, definitely have a counterpoint, because obviously they don't want to, if they've got investors, right, they don't want to say, oh, actually, I don't think it really works, or it's not really science. I mean, it's, you know what I mean? Like, I'm sure there are many people who will argue completely in good faith, but
yeah, that's a really good point. So we really need to be, we need to figure out how to put the right panel together so that we come at it like super objectively, for sure.
Yeah, and one of the things about quantum computing is it's like, so they have theoretical quantum computing, but they also have these people who are trying to build these quantum computers who think that they should be faster, and that requires a lot of money. So again, I would say just kind of think about the economics of it, which is that, you're not going to get a lot of money, especially from private investment, if you say, oh, it might work, but it probably won't, right? You have to say it's definitely going to work.
But I heard there was some substantial investments that have been put in as of late, and I think that's what raised the eyebrows at the last conference that I attended, and I was, like I said, I just got here. Why are people freaking out? So
absolutely. Well, I don't think it's a reason to freak out. So what I think the main thing that people are concerned about in the aspect of blockchain, I'm pretty sure, is the fact that a quantum computer could break these digital signature schemes. A lot of them, like ECDSA, which they use in kind of blockchain. There are some things they can't do. So they can't, for example, reliably sort of break hash functions. So invert hash functions. So it's like, say what the input was given the output for a hash function.
But I heard that there are some arguments that they can, because there's ways to, and now I'm speaking outside of my knowledge, but it was something about like how they can like reduce the solution space by 50% or almost half it, and then that means that they don't need as much time so then they can actually run whatever it is they need to do in order to break it. And so before you put, like, as you're making a transaction, it can like interrupt that transaction. So that is my very superficial understanding of the situation.
I mean, this may well be true. Yeah. I mean, my understanding is they can almost trivially break things like digital signature schemes, like the kind of classic public key signature scheme, the ones that most people use at the moment.
Like the ones
for
in
hash
the
function
banks.
thing, yeah, they may be an advantage that you can get. I think you're right, actually, because I heard that because one of the things they try and break hash functions, they target in a particular area and they try and find a hash collision. So they sort of just do the hashes over and over again. So it tends to be quite, at least when they've broken in the past, quite kind of computationally intensive. And I did hear, in fact, that the quantum computers could mine Bitcoin more efficiently. So that would suggest that there is a way to increase the efficiency of a machine computing hash functions. So yeah, that I think that'll be a very good point.
I think it's something that I need to do some reading on. It's something like I feel like I have to like refresh a lot of topics that I had in my first year of engineering. So
yeah, right.
It was a long time ago.
What I would say about the signature schemes, though, is there are quantum resistant signature schemes. And interestingly, the first public key public-private kind of asymmetric crypto scheme that was ever proposed, I believe it was a guy called Ralph Merkle who proposed it when he was an undergraduate. And that was quantum resistant. So that was the first one they ever proposed. It was less efficient to implement, and that's why they ended up settling on these, things like, kind of elliptic curve cryptography. But the quantum-resistant digital signature schemes do exist. And in fact, the first asymmetric crypto that was ever suggested was quantum-resistant.
Okay. Okay. So it's starting
to
come together.
Change,
yeah.
I believe it is possible.
Yeah. All right. Well, I will reach out to you when we get further with this topic of discussion, because I think just having people with knowledge of the community and the space, and then a background that is relevant to bring it out to the community, and also because we are a scientific platform, I thought, well, we should be addressing what matters to our members, and this is definitely something to discuss. Like, what is the science?
I think that would be a fascinating thing to have a debate on. I encourage you to do it and go out of your comfort zone.
Yeah, what does the science say, and what is industry saying, and why are they doing this, and is blockchain even a target, and that kind of stuff. So cool. So we have a super long recording. Thank you so much for joining and talking with me, and yeah, I think we had some really nice like spaces that we touched upon. I'm sure we could have like 20 more different podcasts on like different topics. So yeah, let's just keep this going. But thank you so much for your time and for joining us.
Yeah, thank you. It's a pleasure. Good to talk to you.